Hi and welcome to my close-up special. You'll probably notice that I've not called this a macro seminar because I'm going to be looking at Sony's macro lenses, but also those lenses that have a very close focusing distance. Now, a lot of the stuff that you see out there online that claims to be macro photography could have actually been photographed with a lens that just has a good close focusing distance. So hopefully this seminar will show you some tips and techniques when using macro workflows, but also lets you work out whether the lenses you currently own will allow you to do the sort of close-up photography that you would like to do. Now, if I'm trying to define what is actually macro, it's basically where something of a particular size will record the same size on the image sensor. So this illustration shows an SD card. Now the width of this SD card is actually 24 millimeters. Now if you photograph that with a macro lens with a 1:1 magnification ratio, it would actually fill the frame of a full frame camera. So this is where 1:1 macro comes into its own. Basically you have to be recording stuff that is super small and you want it to appear super large on the frame of your image. So without much further ado, let's get started. Now this is going to be a very busy slide, so you are going to maybe want to pause and look at this in greater detail. Now I'm listing some of the lenses that I want to highlight in this presentation in that extreme left column. Now the three on the top are Sony's macro lenses. The first two are full frame macro lenses, and then we have an APS-C macro lens. The lenses below that are the ones that have good close focusing distance. Right at the bottom with that black field is the FE85mm f1.8. Now this doesn't have a great close focusing distance, but I do want to showcase this lens as what it is actually capable of. Then we have two APS-C zoom lenses that also have a good close focusing distance, and then we have another two options which will allow us to get a greater magnification, and that is the 1.4 times teleconverter and AF macro extension tubes. The only downside of that 1.4 times teleconverter is it doesn't actually fit to many of the lenses that I've outlined here, primarily just those zoom telephoto lenses, i.e. the 100-400 GM and the 70-200 GM. It doesn't actually attach to all of the other lenses outlined here. The AF macro extension tubes, however, will attach to all of these, and you actually can stack a 1.4 times teleconverter with an AF macro extension tube. Now the AF macro extension tubes are also the cheapest option to get even closer to your subject. Now I've listed some Velo AF extension tubes there that are $82 US, but you can actually find cheaper options out there as well. Now I've highlighted a couple of the fields here with yellow text. Now the top column there for a lens which has a good close focusing distance with a good level of magnification is that 100-400 G master lens. The closest focusing distance is only 3.2 feet or 98 centimeters, but it has a 0.35 magnification. That's only a third of the magnification of a 1:1 macro lens, but you will see that in many instances that is magnification enough for most users. Now we then have a couple of columns down also with lenses with a good close focusing distance and a good level of magnification. The other one I've highlighted in yellow there is the 2470 f2.8 Mark II G Master, which has a close focusing distance of just 8.3 inches. Now its magnification isn't quite as good as the 100-400, but we are positioned a lot closer to the subject matter. So when we're working out the ideal lens for what we need to achieve, it's a mixture of how close we are from the subject and also the magnification factor as well. So if you need to be very close to your subject, the 24-70 will be the best close focusing distance lens. But if you need to put a little bit of distance between you and your subject, then the 100-400 will be the better option there. Now if we compare these magnification factors of 0.35 and 0.32 with just an average lens such as the 85mm f1.8, we can see that it has a magnification factor of 0.13. Now you will find stores like B&H in their specifications, and also the Sony website will list both the close focusing distance of a particular lens and also the magnification factor. So if your lens is not listed here, you will be able to find that information online. I do think I've listed or found most of the lenses which have a magnification factor greater than 0.2 here. I may have missed one or two in that process. Okay, so what I think is a good close focusing distance is any lens which can achieve a 0.25 magnification factor. What I think is excellent, such as the 100-400 GM, is something with a 0.32 to 0.35 magnification factor, and of course then we have the macro lenses which have to achieve that 1 macro magnification factor. Now I'm going to show you what the 100-400 is capable of, and because you know the size of an SD card, I've chosen to showcase how big that SD card is when we get to that closest focusing distance. Now the images I've cropped in Lightroom, they're the full height, so I haven't cropped into the top or bottom of the image. I've just cropped them to a square aspect ratio so you can see all three of these comparisons on a single slide. Now you could imagine this maybe is for a wedding photographer. It's the rings on maybe a cushion that you're photographing, and you can see that possibly for many people that 0.35 magnification factor is in close enough. Now remember, we could crop in post-production to get an even tighter framing. But I'm not doing that here. I'm just showing you how close we can get to that SD card to get the SD card as large as possible in that image. So on the bottom left there we have that FE100-400. We're at that 400 zoom and we're getting that full 0.35 times magnification. If I move any closer to the SD card, I can't pull focus, so I will have to just step back a little bit. I can, however, get a little bit closer. If I don't want to crop in post, I could crop in camera just by switching to APS-C mode, and we can see in that image in the center at the bottom row there, we can see how much that physically enlarges or magnifies that subject. Now you could alternatively crop in post, but I'm just showing you what that image looks like in APS-C mode. The same would be said if we put that full frame lens on an APS-C camera. We would get that magnification that we're seeing in that bottom row, the center image. Now if we shoot in APS-C mode with a 1.4 times teleconverter, we enlarge the image even more. So we're not cropping in post, we're just showing what the camera will look like with cropping in camera, APS-C mode, with that 1.4 times teleconverter, and that would be the same magnification if we were putting that lens combination also on an APS-C camera. Now let's have a look at the 70-200 GM. Now we're working at that 70mm focal length this time, not the maximum telephoto, and we're getting good levels of magnification at that 70mm focal length. So not quite as good as the 100, but it's very, very close. We're getting that 0.32 times magnification at that 70mm. If I move into APS-C mode, we're getting a 0.48 times magnification, and if we move into APS-C mode with a 1.4 times, we're getting 0.67 magnification. If I switched out the 1.4 teleconverter for a 10mm AF extension tube, which again goes behind the lens, we would get not quite as good as the 1.4 but almost a 0.58 times magnification. And if we use the 10mm extension tube and the teleconverter, we get 0.73. Now we're going more than full frame here, so that SD card goes off the top and the bottom of that frame when we're shooting with that combination. Now again, this is not macro, it's 0.73. We'd have to be up to 1.00 to get that full macro capability. But again, many photographers will think, well, I'm actually close enough because I don't actually photograph anything smaller. And remember, we still haven't cropped in post-production, and most of us have got megapixel rich cameras where we can do that without lowering the quality of the outcome at all. Now, before we move in and show you some examples of using both macro lenses and also lenses with a good close-up distance, I'll show you my macro settings for when using a tripod and a macro lens. Now, they will differ slightly to using other lenses with just a good close focusing distance and handheld. So raw, aperture priority, f11, ISO 100, single shooting. Focus mode will be manual with a macro lens. The macro lenses tend to have slower AF, and so I just find it just faster and easier just to manually focus. And then I will choose one of the macro lenses. Now, the macro lens that would be my choice for close-up photography of small things would perhaps be the 90mm macro. The 50mm macro, you just have to be a little bit closer, and you are at risk of putting a small shadow over your subject or frightening your subject if it's alive. So I would also have MF assist on just to fine-tune the focus. This is where it magnifies the view so we can get critical focus when turning the focus ring. The metering would be exposed to the right, so I'd be using the zebras as well, and I'd have steady shot off, especially if using a macro lens that is not a Sony macro lens, because you don't want vibration from the gyros in the lens to create a vibration in the camera because it's attached to a tripod. Now, these are the differences if I'm using handheld. Now, I will use autofocus instead of manual focus, and I'll choose the focus area as an AF tracking expand spot. The reason for not using maybe zone or wide is we have very, very shallow depth of field when working very close up or with a long telephoto lens. So we do want to put that expand spot on the key area of the subject. Often we can only photograph on part of the subject. So in this instance where we've got this crocodile's eye on the right, I want to put the expand spot not on the eyelid, not on the skin around the eye, but actually on the iris of the eye itself. Now, if I do move over to full-time DMF, I might have MF assist left on, but not all lenses support this. I'd still be using exposed to the right, ETTR, and I would have steady shot on, mode 1 on the lens, because I'm trying to keep the camera as still as possible. Now, to put this all in perspective, I'm going to show you now a lens which only fits in slightly short of the good magnification. This is an APS-C lens. It's the E1655 F2.8G. Really nice premium quality zoom lens for the APS-C cameras. Can also be used on full frame cameras as well. It's a lighter alternative than maybe the 2470 GM. What we do have is a 0.2 times magnification. So this is about as close as I can get to these small mushrooms. But again, this is technically not a macro shot because I don't need to get any closer. This is the perfect framing, I think, for this little group of mushrooms that I found on a forest floor here. But it shows that we don't always have to use a macro lens in order to shoot very small subjects at close range. And I think if I had had a macro lens, I possibly wouldn't have gone any closer to this subject. Now, just to highlight some macro techniques here that I use, a lot of people have traditionally used flash with macro in forests, but a lot of photographers are actually switching to using continuous light sources. The LED torches and lights that we can now use are very, very bright, and also the high ISO performance of the cameras are much better. So we don't need to be using flash at ISO 100. We can actually be using these continuous light sources, stopping down to F8 or F11 and just using these, and these are a lot faster and quicker and more agile to actually set up in these forest situations. You can see a couple of examples there, one on the top right where the photographer is holding the camera and the torch, and one on the bottom right where my friend Darren Leal is lying down on the forest floor, and another person is holding the torch at an angle. And of course, as we move the LED continuous light sources to one side or at an angle, we can get backlighting and side lighting and get more character, and also keep the ISO relatively low. And remember, this is the shot that I showed earlier, but I'm actually using my little LED panel here, slightly behind the subject matter, to give that beautiful backlighting and to highlight that water droplet that's hanging off the edge of that mushroom on the right side there. So you can see that technique with a light source being put into good play on one of my own images here. Now, one of the things that some macro photographers will often do is when you go out and you may be stopping down to F8 or F11 to increase the depth of field, and you notice your shutter speed is slowing down. If there's a small breeze, the flower that you might be photographing might be moving slightly, and you're at risk of having subject blur. In order to keep the ISO low, when using these shutter speeds, you may want to construct a windbreak. I jumped onto YouTube, just typed in macro windbreak, and the first two videos came up. One guy constructing this thing out of clear panels with some tape, and then all of that can fold flat and he can carry that into the forest. Another guy using this plastic, perhaps an ice cream container, has cut out a window. He's put a black piece of fabric at the rear end so that when he photographs his flower, it's completely isolated from the wind, but the light can come through the sides and the top of the clear plastic container, and he does have that nice black background behind his flower. So a couple of good options if you do want to use those slower shutter speeds. If that is not an option for you and you do need to raise the ISO because you're also raising or using a shorter duration shutter speed, then just remember you could invest in some post-production software which is great for suppressing the high ISO noise. And one of the products that I've reviewed that I've had good results with is DxO Pure Raw 2. The image you're looking at full screen here is shot at 12,800 ISO, and obviously it was a lot noisier before I processed the raw file. So let's take a look at an image that I wouldn't normally say has a good close focusing distance. Remember, it only has a magnification ratio of 0.13, but here I've used it to good effect in Japan to photograph some spring blossom on the tree, and I've managed to move in quite close to this even though it doesn't have a great close focusing distance. And the way I've done this is I've been using the 85mm lens on an APS-C camera. So the 0.13 magnification factor, if you apply the 1.5 times APS-C crop to that, we get up to a 0.19 magnification factor. So we're approaching that zoom lens that we were using on that APS-C camera, that 1655 f2.8G lens. So because it's a slightly longer focal range, we are getting a good working distance and also an acceptable close focusing distance. And as you can see, I'm isolating things here, such as this piece of fauna in a bamboo forest. And you can see, again, for many people, even though this lens doesn't really have a great close focusing distance, again, some photographers might say, well, actually, this is close enough. And of course, if you're not putting it on an APS-C camera, you can just put your camera in APS-C mode or crop more aggressively in post-production. So again, here is that 85mm f1.8. I'm getting in close to these monkeys in barley grooming. Now I am at the closest focusing distance. The depth of field does become very shallow when we step in. That is something that I really like about this type of work. And you can see that I've also cropped in post. So rather than cropping in camera in this instance, I've cropped in post-production because I couldn't get any closer when I was standing in front of the monkeys. So I've simply got closer by cropping tighter in post-production. Now here is an APS-C lens that does have a good magnification factor. It has a 0.29. It is one of the better APS-C lenses out there. Perhaps it is the best apart from that APS-C macro lens. Now this is the 18-135. It's quite an affordable lens. It's often seen as a lens that is bundled with an APS-C camera, so one could also describe it as an alternative kit lens to the 1650mm power zoom that is often bundled with the APS-C cameras. Now the 18-135, however, has a much closer focusing distance than the other zoom lens, which is often purchased by people with those APS-C cameras, which is the 18-105 f4G. Now that's a good power zoom lens, but if a close focusing distance is a priority, then I would certainly look at the 18-135 instead of the 18-105. Now this is quite a large ant, and so I haven't got as close as I would like to go in camera, so I've cropped in post. The 6K crop obviously is the 6000 by 4000 pixels resolution of the APS-C cameras, but I've cropped to a 4K image. That's 3840 pixels wide, and I think I've got close enough to create a good hero image of this ant that I photographed in sand dunes in Western Australia. And here is another image that I captured, this time in America, of this reptile here climbing some twigs. And again, I've managed to get in and isolate just the head of this creature here. Again, that 0.29 magnification may be close enough for many photographers owning one of these APS-C cameras. Now another lens, telephoto lens, that doesn't have a great close focusing distance perhaps is the 70-200 f4G. The 2.8 Mark II has a much better close focusing distance, but this one has just a 0.13. But again, I've been using this on an APS-C camera. Again, you could use it in APS-C mode on a full frame camera, and you bring up that magnification factor from 0.13 to 0.19. Now if you were wanting to get really close, now this is the aperture of a Nikkor lens, an 85mm Nikkor lens. I have to say the Sony 85mm lenses are a lot better, create a lot smoother bokeh because of the rounder aperture blades, but this is a Nikkor lens that I've got in really close with the 30mm APS-C macro lens. It's quite a sharp lens in the central area, and one of the great advantages of this 30mm macro is it's got a very lightweight 6 ounces or 169 grams. Its close focusing distance, you do have to get in very close to your subject to get that 1.1 macro. You have to get within 3.74 inches or 9.5 centimeters to get that 1.1 macro magnification. Let's put this in a more typical situation where we might be photographing an insect and we want to getting really close to enlarge that insect as large as possible. Now obviously if you're getting in very close to something that will see you coming and you put a shadow over your subject, it might just fly away. So sometimes having a longer focal length on your macro can be advantageous. But here we have a good macro shot of this cicada that I photographed. And I've had to get in to the closest focusing distance to enlarge the subject this much. I have to say, even for full frame users, if you're only an occasional macro photographer, it is perhaps a macro lens that you could consider owning if you don't mind shooting in APS-C mode, just because it takes up very little room in your camera bag. It does weigh just 169 grams or 6 ounces, and it is exceptionally affordable at just $298 US. If you are getting more into macro and you're certainly wanting something with premium quality, then you will obviously go full frame, and you'll probably want to be looking at the FE 90mm M2.8, the M for macro, the 2.8 for 2.8, and it's a G lens. It does have optical steady shot, so that will help if your shutter speeds are getting a little bit slower, and you will be at an easier 11-inch or 28 centimeters working distance from your subject. So it just makes photographing these butterflies just that little bit easier, because I'm not having to get just 3 inches away from the head of this butterfly. So this is certainly of interest for people who want to enlarge very small insects this much in camera. Now just remember, just because it's listed as a macro lens, it doesn't stop you from photographing non-macro subjects just because it's called a macro lens. So a couple of people asked me about this when this lens first came out. They were actually surprised I was shooting portraits with a macro lens, but it's a great focal length for shooting portraits. It doesn't have the AF speed of the 85mm prime, so if you're shooting subjects, portraits where the people are moving, you would be better off with an 85mm prime. But this does have the right focal length for a head and shoulders portrait, and it is a very sharp lens. You just have to allow for the slower AF on these macro lenses. All macro lenses tend to have quite slow AF, and it can be a little bit frustrating if your subject is moving or you're working at very close range waiting for the lens to acquire the subject. Now this is a lot of people posting images that they say are macro images, such as this tree frog. Would this subject need a macro lens? Am I closer than a lens that does have a closer focusing distance? So you can see in that inset in the top left hand corner, this is the approximate size of this tree frog that I've been capturing here. And so it's a very small creature, especially as you could close your fingers around this subject here. So does this require a lens with a 1:1 magnification? So the next image of the same tree frog was actually captured with the 100-400, and I haven't cropped this image in post, or only a little bit in post, just to fit the 16:9 aspect ratio. It was actually easier to photograph with the 100-400 because of the faster AF of the 100-400, and I managed to fill the frame of this full frame camera. I think it was captured with an A7R2 with the 0.35 magnification factor of this 100-400. One of the downsides of this is because it is a dark environment, the ISO has climbed to 5000. But if I show the previous image, even though this has a wider 2.8 aperture, I actually stopped this lens down to f6.3 just so I could get a little bit more sharp detail, expand the depth of field just a little bit more for this type of macro shot. So the ISO was still at 5000 even though I had a lens with 2 stops wider. And you can see the magnification factor on this lens would have been around that 0.35, which is actually listed on the barrel of the lens as you go in closer and closer and pull focus on your subject. Here is an even smaller creature photographed with the 100-400 at 400 millimeters. Now I've come in as close as I can at the minimum focusing distance of this lens, and because I would like to go even closer but wasn't able because I've reached my minimum focusing distance, I've just cropped from 6K to 4K in post-production. I think this was captured with an Alpha 9 camera, so I've just come into that 3840 pixel crop in post-production. So I've managed to get the subject even larger in the frame just by cropping. I could do that in camera, or I could do that in post-production. If you need to get very, very close to your subject, then of course the new 2470 F2.8 G Master 2 is great for getting in really close. This was captured around the 8-inch distance mark, and so that the angle of view of the wider focal lengths does change the nature of the background behind the subject that you're wanting to photograph. So again, this might be something you want to factor in. Do you want to be working at the greater distances, or do you want a lens that has a very good close focusing distance and also a good magnification factor there as well? Now the 12-24s have good close focusing distance, but don't have the magnification factor. For instance, the 12-24 lenses have a good close focusing distance, but only have a magnification factor of 0.14. So again, I think I've highlighted some of the best lenses that have a good combination of both. Now, one of the other longer primes that also has a good close focusing distance is the 135. It has a 0.25 magnification factor. Not as good as the 70-200 GM Mark II or the 100-400, but it still fits in that good category for me. And it's a nice focal length to be working with these small subjects here. So this is a lens that I can recommend for getting in really close with as well. And obviously, if you do want to use the wider apertures, which I have in this instance, the depth of field is exceptionally shallow. I've tried to put it on the eyes of this little hermit crab on this beach, but you'll notice that most of the rest of the creature is in soft focus. And of course, I've had to crop in even tighter. I've come down, this was captured with an Alpha 7 R4, which is a 9K resolution sensor, and I've cropped in now to approximately a 6K image. So obviously, being such a high resolution sensor, I could have been photographing something even smaller, maybe a spider, and then just cropped in even tighter if I only needed a 4K output from this. So there you see the flexibility of these type of close focusing lenses, especially when working with high resolution sensors where we can crop more in camera and in post-production. So there's the 135. I'm not needing to crop in post now. This is the large head of a sunflower, and this allows me to get in really close and close enough. I don't need to get in any closer. I could crop much tighter if I wanted just to come into some of those dry leaves in the center of this flower, but of course I actually prefer this composition of this sunflower head. Now let's take a look at getting even closer for even smaller subjects. This is where we can use not only APS-C mode, but perhaps the teleconverters if we're using the 70-200 or 100-400 lenses. Now the 100-400 has a magnification of 0.35. If I add in the APS-C crop, if I add in the 1.4 teleconverter, we're getting up to like 73% extent of the capability of a macro lens. We've got a magnification factor now of 0.73. That's if I've done my maths correctly anyway. We can see we can get in really close to some of the subjects. This frog was really tiny and just emerging not from a lake or even a pond, but just a puddle on a trackway that I was walking along. Okay, so as I talked about minimum focusing distance, sometimes you want a longer focal length and to be further away, and sometimes you want to be much closer. With this particular crocodile, I'm more than happy working at a longer focal length to put me further away from this crocodile. And even with a 1.4 teleconverter, I'm getting the sort of magnification on this crocodile eye that I actually like and want. So this worked out really well with that 1.4 teleconverter, giving me that greater magnification factor. Now the 200-600 doesn't have a great close focusing distance or a good magnification ratio, but you might be able to work on it perhaps with the teleconverter, APS-C mode, maybe with an AF macro extension tube. You might be able to get close enough, but certainly the 100-400 has a much better closer focusing distance than the 200-600. So let's just show you that chart again. You might want to pause at some of the lenses I've outlined here now. So I've outlined the 100-400 GM, the 70-200 GM2, the 24-70 GM2. Other good ones that I haven't talked about in this presentation yet is the 70-300 lens, which has a magnification factor of 0.31. One of the better prime lenses, G-Master prime lenses, is the 35mm f1.4 with a magnification factor of 0.26. Now I've talked about the 135. Another good one is the 100 f2.8 GM STF, which has a 0.25 magnification factor. One thing to bear in mind with this lens, however, it lists an aperture of 2.8, but it has a light transmission value of f5.6 because of that smooth transfocus feature that is in that lens. Better for great smooth bokeh, but you will find your ISO climbing because it behaves like an f5.6 lens for ISO, 2.8 lens for shallow depth of field. Now I've listed the 18-135 APS-C lens and the 16-55 lens, and we've talked about the advantage of using teleconverters, but obviously they can only be used with the telephoto zooms, and we'll talk a little bit more about the AF macro extension tubes. Now I do list this in my accessories and gifts guide that is available for patrons, and you can click on the links if you want to buy these from B&H. You will find cheaper versions of these, such as the Niwa AF extension tubes. They typically come in twin packs of 10mm and 16mm, and you can stack them together. Now these AF extension tubes don't have any glass elements, so you're not really downgrading the capabilities or sharpness of your lens by moving these. They also have AF capability, so you retain your AF, you retain all of the information being passed to the camera about focal length and aperture, etc. You may take a downward step in AF speed, but of course when we're working in macro we sort of expect to be working with a slightly slower AF. Even those telephoto zooms such as the 100-400, which have very fast AF for sports action, if we are working very close to our subject, we will find focus is slowing down just because the lens elements are having to be moved much further in order to change focus at very close focusing distance. Perhaps one of the lenses now that is great at the close focusing distance is the new 70 to 200 GM2, because it has 4 linear XD focus motors. So I suspect that it is really good at fast focus at close focusing distance. I will try that out over coming weeks to see whether that's the case. So here's macro extension tubes, and this is something that you might want to consider if you don't have any lenses with excellent close focusing distances and good magnification ratios. So the lens I'm isolating here is an 85mm lens, because it's one of the lenses that I'm often carrying with me at all times. It only has that magnification of 0.13. So what I've done is I've got a little Mickey Mouse toy here, and you can see it's about the same size or just a little bit larger than the E mount that we're working with on our cameras, to give you an idea of the size of this Mickey Mouse. Now, top right, the closest possible distance, Mickey Mouse is not very large with the 85mm at the closest focusing distance. It gets a lot better once we add that 10mm extension tube, however. That raises, it almost doubles the magnification ratio from 0.13 to 0.25. If I switch out the 10mm extension tube to the 16mm extension tube, we get into the excellent magnification ratio now, which is 0.32. So we're now matching those GM2 lenses just with the 85, which didn't have a great close focusing distance, but with the addition of those extension tubes, we're now getting a great close focusing distance. And if we stack both the 10mm and the 16mm, we're getting a really good close focusing distance now, 0.45 magnification ratio, which surpasses anything, any of the lenses without using the extension tubes. Okay, so there is an extension tube calculator you can use. This will be a live link in the PDF that I'll make available with this seminar, and this is where you can work out, you have to put in your native magnification, so you have to sort of know the native magnification of your lens that you're using, then you put in the focal length, and then you put in the extension tube, and then you get the new magnification ratio. So if you can see how I've done some of the maths here. I've extended the 0.13 magnification ratio of my 85mm prime, and now I've got a new magnification ratio of 0.44 with working with both extension tubes together. Now, another one of the macro lenses that I haven't talked about in this presentation yet, but I do use, and I actually value the close focusing distance of this macro lens over the 90mm, is the 50mm F2.8 lens. Now, it does allow me to digitize my analog film using that Nikon ES2 adapter. Now, I have highlighted using this one, and you'll see a link there to purchase this from the B&H store. You do need a step-up ring, 58mm to 62mm, because this was designed for a Nikon macro lens, but it will work with the Sony macro, just if you change the filter diameter there to fit Sony's macro lens. Now, you will see me highlight the whole workflow from capture through to post-production in the digitizing film Patreon seminar there, where I'll go through the whole workflow. Now, I do highlight in this seminar that you could also use this Nikon ES2 film adapter with the 90mm macro. It just gets a little bit strange when we see what we've got to do, because the close focusing distance is not so close as the 50mm macro. We must put the ES2 adapter further away from the lens. So I did find this online. This is not my setup, this is somebody else's setup. They managed to use pretty much most of the Neewer step up and step down rings to put that ES2 adapter at the right distance from the 90mm macro. The results would be good, but it just takes a little bit of more time to actually set that up. Let's finish off this presentation with a little bit more about macro in itself. There are going to be some photographers who were looking at some of those examples saying that's not close enough for me. I actually want to have the head of an insect fill the entire frame. And of course, if that is the route you're going, you are going to be looking at a dedicated macro lens, and the best Sony macro lens you can buy is this 90mm f2.8 macro lens. It is exceptionally sharp and it does get you very, very close to your subject. The advantages are that it does have that 1:1 magnification without having to shoot in APS-C mode, use 1.4 teleconverters, you use AF extension tubes. It has that native 1:1 macro in that capability. It too, it is very, very sharp. It is one of Sony's sharpest primes. It has very, very precise manual focus as well, which is good because I probably would be using it in manual focus, not autofocus. And the only disadvantage I would possibly point out, it does have slow AF compared to primes such as the 85, the 100, the 135 primes. And for me, perhaps the bokeh of those would be slightly better because we've got access to slightly wider apertures when using those lenses as well. Okay, so people who are really getting into macro probably also want to start looking at owning a macro rail. I could perhaps use the 140mm rail that I use for panoramic work, but of course dedicated macro rails allow you to move the camera forwards and backwards by turning a geared knob there that you can slowly just inch, or not even inch, but move the camera just a fraction of an inch or a millimeter forwards or backwards. And one of the reasons that macro photographers want to do this is they want to get the 1:1 magnification, the maximum magnification, and then move the plane of focus forwards and backwards through the subject by moving the camera, not by moving the focus ring. Now this does remove anything that you might have in your lens like focus breathing. It does keep the size of the subject exactly the same as we're changing the plane of focus. And the reason we're changing the plane of focus is when we're working at 1:1 magnification with a macro lens, even stopping down to f11 or f16, the depth of field is still exceptionally shallow. So often we want to build up the depth of field by taking multiple images where the focus is at a slightly different distance from the lens. We can then stack those individual images in a piece of software such as Helicon Soft. You can do this in Photoshop, but it's obviously not as good as a dedicated focus stacking program such as this one by Helicon Soft here. So you might want to check this out. You'll see the example here. They're using many images that they're going to stack. I do know a macro photographer who will often just stop down another aperture, maybe to f16 or maybe even to f22, so they don't have to take so many individual images in order to stack. And so obviously you're not going to get as sharp focus at f22 as you are at f16 or f11, but if you want to shoot fewer images that you're going to stack in post-production, that might be an option that you consider. So I'm not a dedicated macro photographer, but if you're wanting to check maybe a Sony alpha photographer who does use the 90mm macro lens to great effect, it's this Australian photographer called Steve Axford. He specializes in photographing fungi, and you'll see his work in high resolution, ultra high resolution on his Flickr site here. I put a little inset image in the bottom right here, which is of an ant hanging upside down with something that appears to be growing the ant. And this was something I learned from Steve at one of his macro presentations when I was seeing him present live in Australia, is this fascinating story where there's this relationship between ant colonies and a particular fungus, which the ant farms for its own colonies, but the poisons or toxins in the fungi actually send the ants slightly crazy, and in a dying activity the ants will climb to the branch of a high tree, die, and then the spores of the fungi will then germinate from the body of the dead ant. So basically the fungi can get a distribution of its spores by using the ant colony. Fascinating story. With that fascinating story, that concludes my macro presentation. Again, with any of these seminars, if you've got in-depth questions that you want to ask me, or if you note any issues with my mathematics on any individual slide, just put a message down in the forum below and I'll try and get back to you as quickly as possible. Hopefully you found this seminar useful, and I'll catch you online very soon. Okay, cheers.